Despite a high percentage of Native Americans, women included, who served in World War I and World War II, they were not allowed to vote in the country for which they had served. New Mexico was one of several states where Indians not taxed could not vote because Native people were living on reservations, did not pay property taxes. Miguel Trujillo Sr., Isla de Pueblo, filed a lawsuit in U.S. District Court which argued that although he did not pay property tax on Pueblo land, he paid federal income tax, gasoline tax, and sales tax. A 3-judge panel in Santa Fe ruled in Trujillo's favor, finding that the New Mexico Constitution violated the 14th and 15th Amendments. On August 3, 1948, Trujillo, a World War II Marine sergeant, won Native Americans the right to vote in New Mexico. It was said that Native Americans joined the U.S. military to honor their end of the treaty. From just about the beginning of the United States itself, the government has fought various wars against Native nations. And that's the irony, which was stated by Patty Lowe, director of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University. But Native Americans from tribes in Oklahoma to nations in Washington joined the U.S. military to honor their end of the treaty that the U.S. government previously broke, Lowe said. At the onset of World War I, the first generation of Native Americans after the so-called Indian Wars began joining the U.S. Army, even though they weren't considered citizens or allowed to vote. Returning veterans, and also those from World War II, earned accolades for their service. For example, Comanche and Diné code talkers in World War II were credited for passing secrets amid hostile fighting in some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The returning veterans began demanding the right to vote and fought against discrimination. For example, with Miguel Trujillo, and a number of veterans from Isla de Pueblo in New Mexico returned and waged a legal battle to overthrow or overturn that state's law that barred Native Americans living on reservations from participating in elections. Both Arizona and New Mexico's disenfranchisement of Native people were deemed unconstitutional in 1948 in 2 cases brought by World War II veterans, including Miguel Trujillo and Frank Harrison. But the battle expanded Native voting rights and was far from over. And you can see that also in Harrison versus Levine. And today we still see efforts to gerrymander and restrict voting access in rural areas with large Native American populations. United States Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland stated, "I entered politics to carry on his legacy, to increase voter turnout in Indian country," Haaland said regarding Miguel Trujillo. "We are fortunate here in New Mexico that ours is one of the few that has earned national praise for fair elections. Our Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, continues to steer our elections to be inclusive of all communities. Marginalized veterans have been instrumental in the fight for equality, and we can certainly continue this trend." In terms of active duty personnel and religious beliefs, going from DoD January 2019, 70% were recorded as Christian, about 32% no denomination, 20% Catholic, 18% Protestant, and 1% Mormon. 24% were reported as other, unclassified, or unknown. 2% as atheist or agnostic. 1% as affiliated with an Eastern religion, and 0.4% as Jewish or Muslim. There are currently approximately 1 million LGBTQIA veterans in the United States. Looking solely at women means we miss things and fail to recognize systems of oppression when compounded. There are also challenges based on sexual orientation. There's also homophobic discrimination, structural and religious forces demonizing LGBTQIA status, elevated risks of suicide, mental health challenges, alcohol and or drug abuse, misuse, and physical health disparities. There are an estimated 134,000 to 163,000 transgender veterans. Gender-based discrimination must also include an examination of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, lack of reintegration support or tailored programs, holdover from military that is perpetuated in the civilian world, and how much of this is compounded if the veteran is gender diverse or non-cisgender. Additional challenges faced by the LGBTQIA veteran community include mental health challenges, military sexual trauma, drug abuse or misuse, suicide, homelessness, divorce, other economic indicators, trust and connection, criminal justice involvement, and identity that is fractured. In a 2015 study, it was indicated that transgender veterans are twice as likely to have justice system involvement. Discharge status may have an outsized impact on LGBTQIA veterans who have been involuntarily separated from the military under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. If separated with other than honorable discharge, these veterans would not have the same access to veteran benefits, compounding an overall distrust of the military and veteran system and feeling of unwelcome. Under DADT and prior policies, between the end of World War II and the repeal of DADT, over 100,000 service members were discharged with bad paper because of their actual or perceived LGBTQIA status. Bad paper discharges have lifelong consequences for veterans, including a permanent bar from government jobs, a loss of access to VA care and benefits, loss of assistance in the transition from military to civilian life, and serious disadvantages in the job market. This perpetual deprivation of benefits and opportunities exacerbates a military to prison pipeline for those who are systematically marginalized already. Other points to consider include transgender veterans' access to medically necessary and life-saving care, LGBTQIA harassment at VA facilities, which shows that 60% of LGBTQIA veterans have experienced discrimination and harassment at some point while seeking care at VHA facilities, that 14,000 service members separated from the military under DADT may need to appeal their discharge status to receive care, that members of the LGBTQIA community repeatedly report fear and mistrust in deciding whether to access their VA services. Compared to non-LGBTQIA women veterans, LGBTQIA women veterans attributed missing needed care more often in the previous 12 months to concerns about interacting with other veterans, and considering the minority stress model, resulted in poorer health and earlier deaths. This results from a combination of factors, including the stress of concealment, discrimination, and stigma, including institutional stigma as evidenced by non-inclusive policies. Navigating the effects of homophobia in the veteran community include microaggressions, institutionalized and direct violence, marginalization in the veteran community, institutionalized discrimination that often mirrors that of the military, being asked to keep their personal life separate, and being kept from positions of leadership or being discounted. When we put all these different lenses together, from gender through race, religion, and orientation among so many intersecting aspects that we carry, what do we see? We see changes in religious demographics. We see justice system interactions and incarceration. We see a political climate for minorities, women, and LGBTQIA veterans. We see veteran service organizations and how they've been responding, in addition to media representation, underrepresented voices, data equity and disaggregation, complex polytrauma and access to care, existing and non-existent resources. Many of these challenges are undoubtedly multi-layered and require a strategic approach. On the micro level, individual treatment and access to care is limited based on intersectional identities and compounded by each aspect that represents a marginalized community. On the mezzo level, when veterans lack resources and/or community in which they feel safe, reintegration disparities increase and leaves marginalized groups even more vulnerable. On the macro level, dominant culture, community, and institutions impact marginalized communities by perpetuating toxic cultures and outdated policies. While something called military genograms is used in military social work, which is often a one-page diagram outlining family systems and trauma, one could use the intersectionality chart from the IT and CRT session as a more comprehensive guide and a great jumping-off point for delving into comprehensive one-time interviews. In Army mental health, intake interviews were roughly 2 hours, but that also meant that the client didn't have to keep retelling their story or bits and pieces for providers to figure out. Data equity and inclusion relies on not only asking these questions and including people in research, it also means figuring out how to address our community in the best way possible. Another point to consider in this is disaggregating data, which is also something that you see in U.S. Veterans Affairs and even DoD literature. And it's something that it's an issue throughout the United States, as evidenced by service rates. When one is part of an exponentially larger group, it absorbs the smaller, marginalized, higher enlisting group. Pertinent data disappears, whether out of ignorance or convenience, and quite possibly both. Hiring more diverse healthcare workers is one suggestion, but I would also suggest screening for narcissistic personality disorder as well as antisocial personality disorder for both military service and veterans care of any variety. Training in DEI and ongoing professional development should also be incorporating critical race theory as well as intersectionality theory as frameworks. We could use these simple methods for examining how socioeconomic disadvantages, mental health care disparities, and institutionalized discrimination affect the military veteran community outcomes in a variety of systems. Overall, having an intersectional strategy incorporates a variety of layers of identity, but remaining vigilant in basic needs being met from medical and mental health care, housing to employment, and benefits is key. Then it's much easier to talk about community engagement and individual empowerment. Intersectionality and wellness means looking at a person's social identities and how they interact with their mental, emotional, physical, and other aspects of wellness. Intersectionality looks at the relationships between these identities. Intersectional wellness is concerned with how multiple forms of oppression influence one's life through factors such as gender identity and expression, race and ethnicity, class and socioeconomic status, sexuality and orientation, age or disability, and other identity lenses. Intersectionality within wellness programs can be very important because it acknowledges that people experience different types of oppression in many different ways. It provides a more holistic approach to wellness by looking holistically at individuals' lives instead of approaching services from a single issue framework. Wellness has been defined by the World Wellbeing Project as the presence of high-quality personal, social, and environmental resources that contribute to the flourishing of individuals, communities, and societies. Intersectional wellness is about optimizing these qualities within many different identities. Intersectionality within wellness would ask how people act in the community to both maintain their general wellness while also working to improve elements such as identity, belonging, connectedness, purpose, autonomy, positive emotions, and negative emotions. This also includes tying in intersectionality and new approaches to mental health and medical care. Individually tailored treatment plans after thorough intake and genograms. Diverse sets of evidence-based interventions. Screening tools for military and healthcare community members. Major requirements for systemic transformation include documenting intersecting lenses in a client-informed, culturally centered manner, building upon military genograms, or with the intersectionality diagram through therapeutic techniques, implementing treatment plans and tracking data for intersectional clinical purposes. The healing continuum is also multi-layered, starting with the individual. DEI tools and resources, equity in medical and mental health care, guides for individuals, and training for providers. Interpersonal, guides for allies, families, and friends. Toolkits for speaking out about intergenerational trauma and discrimination with relationship support and education. Community, advising on fostering community solidarity, promoting camaraderie and intercultural understanding, community events and resources. National, working on policy changes and advocating for legislative changes, the implementation of legislative changes, and institutional adjustments on HR and DEI training. Global, assisting other marginalized groups internationally by sharing resources, toolkits, training, and information. Another great James Baldwin quote to include here is, "What is it that you want me to reconcile myself to? You always told me it takes time. It has taken my father's time, my mother's time, my uncle's time, my brother's and my sister's time, my niece's and my nephew's time. How much time do you want for your progress? Do we need to lend more time for progress, or is the time now?" We have a responsibility to take the lead on these issues and drive meaningful change. In the military, many of us had the experience of working within units tasked with regulating movement. We have obviously served in an era with service members from various backgrounds, social statuses, races, religions, genders, orientations, and so on. Intersectionality in CRT shows us that inclusion can't be achieved through simple policy changes or legislation. It requires cultural changes at all levels of militaries throughout the world that not only support marginalized groups within their own walls, but also seek to embrace diversity in order to create a more equitable society. As veterans, we also need others to understand the importance of self-care, identity, intersectionality, and the need for inclusion, whether it be in our armed forces or civilian life. This movement continues to grow beyond the military, but intersectional veterans have a unique awareness on this topic, as we all have this additional lens in which we examine our world. Ultimately, we are not just another case study. Intersectionality in CRT can be used as strategies which will give hope to those who still suffer, often in silence. It's up to all of us to put an end to preventable casualties off the battlefield by helping others when they come home. Conserving the fighting strength is not limited to military morale. It also means we can't continue to treat our comrades with prejudice or idly stand by and allow it. It means being honest with oneself and taking the appropriate action. From screening tools being used prior to entry into military service through veterans healthcare, the burden of educating institutions shouldn't fall on individual veterans seeking help. It's up to everyone involved to be open to accepting that there is far more to learn and that the voices of marginalized veterans need to be part of building a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable environment. Here are some additional resources for further reading, and now we'll open the floor for discussion.